Rust is no more than a chemical reaction that occurs between a metal and oxygen, forming a new chemical compound known as an oxide, colloquially referred to on metals such as iron as rust. And this chemical process, known as oxidation, is also referred to as corrosion. Guns, of course, are made using metals, meaning they are susceptible to this oxidation or corrosion. Guns most often contain parts made of steel, which is mostly iron, but there are also guns out there containing aluminum, zinc, brass, bronze, zamak, etc. Regardless of what the particular metal is, typically the metals used in guns all have a mechanism by which they react with oxygen and begin to corrode. There are many factors that cause or accelerate corrosion in metals, and there are also many things that we can do to prevent that corrosion. The most obvious cause of corrosion, and the one that we all pretty much understand, is going to be water, chemically known as H2O, meaning it contains oxygen, and it's this oxygen that can react with metals, forming oxides, again, known as rust. Now, I'm sure we've all seen this and understand this mechanism when it comes to liquid water, but it's also important to remember that the air itself contains moisture and water vapor, and this is reflected in the relative humidity percentage on a given day, which you can find out using a hygrometer or just by looking it up for your area. Now, it's also important to understand that this humidity percentage is not a linear measurement of how much water is in the air. It scales exponentially with temperature, with hotter air being able to hold much more moisture than cooler air. Now, just for one example, if you were in an area that was 30 degrees Celsius or 86 degrees Fahrenheit with a humidity level of just 30%, there would be more water in the air than somewhere that was 15 degrees Celsius or 59 degrees Fahrenheit at 100% humidity. So there you have a 17 degree Fahrenheit difference, but you have a 70% humidity difference, and there's the exact same amount of moisture in the air. So humidity and consequently temperature are going to be some of the biggest factors that can cause corrosion. And while we can't control the outside world, when it comes to the indoors and especially storage, we can very easily control these variables through the use of air conditioning. So air conditioning, if you didn't know, is not only great at regulating temperature, but really its primary function is removing humidity from the air through the refrigeration cycle, which I'm sure you can look up on YouTube and someone can explain it much better than I can. But for most people out there with your homes at a reasonable air conditioned temperature in the 70s, the air conditioning will reduce humidity to reasonable levels that can be expected to not pose a significant risk of corrosion to your guns or really anything else containing metal in your house. In plain English, most of you don't have to go out of your way to get special dehumidifiers, and especially not those stupid heat lamps, which are intended to dry out the air and you're safe. But like we discussed earlier, hotter air holding exponentially more moisture, I think that might actually contribute to increasing the amount of moisture in the air, but I digress. If you live in a place like I do, which is hot and humid, you may want to invest in some kind of dehumidifying system specifically for where you store your guns, even if it's something as simple as desiccant tablets in a drawer where you store your handguns. And especially if you like to let the breeze blow through on a windy summer or spring day, as is the Southern tradition. And that's because even if the temperature is at a comfortable spot in like the mid 70s, the humidity might be very high and definitely a lot higher than if your house was being held at the same temperature through the use of central air conditioning. Now, if you live in a place like Arizona and things are really, really dry, you really don't have to worry about the metal on your guns. Now, when it comes to guns that contain a lot of wood, like your old milsurp rifles and stuff like that, the air being too dry can also be an issue, but most people out there own guns that only contain steel, aluminum, and plastic, not wood, so that's beyond the scope of this discussion, maybe for another day. Some of the other factors that are going to accelerate the corrosion process are going to be stuff like salt or acid contamination, which can commonly come from coastal salt spray, high pH levels in rain or fresh water, but also things like sweat, skin oils, and especially blood can be very aggressive contributors to corrosion. With that in mind, understand that if you live in a coastal area near a body of salt water, or if you're taking your guns out on a boat in the ocean, your air is just going to naturally have a high degree of salt spray at all times, which will accelerate corrosion, and you should act accordingly. And if you ever get blood on a gun, especially a blue gun, you need to wipe that off immediately or it will quickly start to rust. And if you want an example of that, I have this surplus Beretta 81. Now, overall, it's in pretty great shape, but if you look right here where the slide meets the breech of the barrel, you can see someone try to do like an overhand rack on the Beretta and got some part of their hand caught in there, causing them to bleed, and then the blood was left on the gun long enough for it to rust. Of course, you Beretta guys out there know that this is a very common pinch point on the Beretta 92 when you're doing stupid stuff. Now, on the other side of things, corrosion can be prevented at the base level by having a metal that is less susceptible to corrosion. Let's take iron as an example, as it's probably the most common metal found in firearms. Now, pure iron is very susceptible to corrosion, and pure carbon steel, which is overwhelmingly just pure iron, isn't much better. Now, to demonstrate that, here I have a bar of 12L14 steel, which is roughly 99% iron, with the remaining 1% being carbon, lead, sulfur, and manganese. Nothing that would really contribute to corrosion resistance, and it has rusted considerably here in the shed over the last few months. Even though it did have some oil on it to prevent corrosion when it was shipped to me, you can definitely see a ton of corrosion, three-dimensional rust, where I made the last cut here on the face, and then the factory face is still pretty rust-free. Pure iron or pure carbon steel being so terrible at corrosion resistance is kind of the reason why we typically use different alloys of steel in firearms that contain stuff like chrome and nickel, which may help the steel in some other properties for the given task of the particular part, but for the purposes of this discussion, they also aid in the prevention of corrosion. A very popular steel that's used in firearms, particularly in stuff like barrels, is 4150 chrome moly vanadium, which, as its name would imply, does contain some chromium, which does aid in corrosion prevention, and this steel is, as a result, fairly resistant to corrosion, at least when compared to a regular carbon steel or pure iron. Now, most things that are made with 4150 chrome moly steel today are finished, so I think the best example to show this effect is going to be with the bolts of Mausers. So way back in the day, Mauser bolts were typically left in the white, which just means without any additional coating or finish applied, and I think the best example are going to be these Swedish Mauser bolts. Now, the Swedes have always been known for producing very high quality steels with, for whatever reason, a very high content of chrome and other metals. And as we can see, even after well over 100 years, there is no sign of serious corrosion on these bolts. And even my worst example from, I believe, 1895, this rifle was sporterized and definitely neglected at one point in its life, because when I got it, the outside of the barrel was just completely rusted. And even with that neglect and this bolt having no finish applied over the top of it, it shows very little corrosion after 130 years. So I think that goes to illustrate what difference just having a nice high quality carbon steel can do in terms of corrosion resistance. The most extreme and obvious example of this would be something like any of the variety of stainless steels out there. Essentially, what makes a stainless steel stainless is a very high percentage of chromium mixed into the alloy. Now, stainless steel might not always have the best mechanical properties for a given task, but it does have excellent corrosion resistance as a result of that high chromium content. And even though stainless steel does have a very high resistance to corrosion, most stainless steels out there can still rust under the right, usually very extreme conditions. The next level of protection up from that is going to be the surface finish of the metal, and that could be something as simple as finishing the part to a high degree of polish, which will reduce the amount of surface area available for oxygen atoms to react with the surface metal, thus giving it more resistance than the part which is finished very roughly. Now, other finishes can include painting, bluing, parkerizing, anodizing, cerakoting, metal plating, etc. And if you know anything about some of those processes, some of them are actually controlled corrosion, such as in the case of traditional rust bluing, which forms a layer of iron oxide, which is black or blue in appearance and has a tighter grain structure than the loose red or brown rust that we seek to avoid typically. In the case of aluminum, which quickly produces an oxide layer as it's exposed to oxygen, can have that process intentionally accelerated in a controlled manner to create a tough and sometimes colorful layer of aluminum oxide in a process known as anodizing. And by the way, on these inox Berettas, the lower is actually aluminum. They just give it sort of this silver anodized finished. Now, something like parkerization, like on the barrel of this Beretta, works in a similar way, but it converts the surface steel to a chemical compound known as a phosphate rather than an oxide. Now, phosphating and anodizing and bluing and all these controlled conversion processes, essentially they all aim to convert the exposed atoms on the surface of the part to a new chemical compound that does not react with oxygen, and it does this in a controlled and visually appealing way before they can be converted to rust in an uncontrolled, damaging, and visually unappealing way. And of course, stuff like Cerakote, paint, powder coating, etc. works pretty intuitively. It's applied over the top of the metal, which just puts a physical barrier between the part and the outside world so that it can't react with oxygen. Metal plating is very similar, whereby you put a layer or layers of a less reactive metal in between the part and the outside world. Most commonly, you start with a layer of copper plating, followed by an exterior plating of nickel, chrome, or if you're feeling really Gucci, gold plating. And of course, if you've ever dealt with like silverware or you've left an old nickel in your pocket, you'll realize that metal plating does eventually react with the oxygen in the outside world, and it does eventually haze up, but it doesn't get aggressively rusted the way that the underlying iron would. So a lot of these factors that either contribute to or prevent corrosion, you're really not going to be able to change or control just to make sure your guns aren't going to rust, right? Like most of us, we're not going to completely upend our lives and move cross country to an area that's less humid just so our guns don't rust, or at least most of us won't. Some of those factors you do have some limited control over, like you can choose to get a stainless steel gun over one that is carbon steel and blued. But even then, you're relying on the manufacturer and whatever steel they picked out to be of a sufficiently high grade to prevent rust to a significant degree. And that's especially true for guns that, for example, aren't made anymore, like antique stuff, older firearms. A lot of them have some pretty low quality steel. And there's also some new guns out there, guns made in the last 30, 40 years that were just made out of pot metal and, you know, are just prone to rusting for whatever reason. And of course, you could always like go and get a gun Cerakoted or refinished, you know, electroless nickel plated or whatever. But that has all the pitfalls and cost and time investment of, you know, any other custom gun work or refinishing work that you might do. So again, that's kind of limiting your control over the situation, because if it's a gun that you can't live without for a few months, then it's really not a real option. So with all that said, by and large, the one area we have the most control over on a day-to-day basis when it comes to preventing rust is going to be that outside layer of protection, which is going to be, I guess you can call them temporary surface treatments or protectants or rust inhibitors, stuff like your CLPs, your 3-in-1 oils, your gun oils, your waxes, greases, cosmoline, stuff like that. Now, these all pretty much do the same thing as any other coating, which is to prevent moisture and air from getting at the underlying metal, but they're not as permanent as something like the actual finish of a firearm, something like Cerakote or paint or parkerizing, for example. These typically have to be reapplied if they're prone to evaporating, like on an oil, or just being rubbed away through normal use. By the way, before we get any further, I would just like to interject that the channel has memberships now, so if you would like to support the channel directly, you can go ahead and do that. I think it starts at $1 or $2 a month, and it would go a long way to helping me reach my goal of doing this YouTube thing full time. We also have a Discord now, link's gonna be in the description and also on my channel page. Now that's sort of a big 1,000-foot overview of some of the main concepts when it comes to corrosion, oxidation, rust, that sort of thing. And most of that can be applied to pretty much anything that rusts. Now when it comes to specific scenarios like carry or hunting or storage or sport shooting, I think there's a few pointers that are important to understand or at least consider when it comes to protecting your guns from corrosion. Now for guns that are carried, these guns will experience the hardest life period, and especially when it comes to corrosion. If the gun is on your hip all day and you are outside all day, you can basically think of the gun as being stored outside and is subject to whatever weather conditions you may find yourself in. The other thing is these guns are in and out of holsters all the time, which will of course remove your surface oils or waxes, whatever you put on it. And it's also going to remove the finish of the gun eventually. And you know, of course you're going to be banging it against things, that'll remove finish. So it opens up a lot of opportunities for your gun to rust and for the finish to come off and to expose the underlying metal. Simply being in a holster for a long period of time can contribute to it corroding, especially if it's something like leather that can attract or store moisture, and then that's going to get pressed up closely against your firearm, which can accelerate rust. This can happen with plastic holsters too. Water, of course, can get in there between the metal and the plastic, press it up against the gun. Now you have essentially a perfect condition to create rust on the firearm. And of course, these guns are typically in close proximity to your body and are much more likely to be exposed to skin oils and sweat, which, as we discussed before, can accelerate corrosion. And finally, these guns are also probably going to be covered in dust and dirt and lint and crumbs, all manner of things that can attract moisture or remove finish or oil from the metal, opening it up to corrosion. So with all that in mind, your carry guns are probably going to be the guns you're going to want to pay the most attention to if you care about them rusting. And consequently, you're going to have to more frequently reapply oil or rust inhibitors, etc., to the surface of the steel. Now, the exact interval as to how often you need to reapply oil or rust inhibitors, I can't make a perfect recommendation to every person out there, as it depends on all of those factors that we just discussed, everything from the type of metal to the type of finish, your local environmental factors, etc. But just understand that carrying a gun is by and large probably the worst normal activity you can do to a gun, and especially its finish. Now, this doesn't apply just to concealed carry. This can apply to open carry, carrying a firearm in the line of duty, carrying a service rifle, right? these guns that are carried often are beat up. And in fact, that's the #1 way to beat up a rifle, is to just carry it and live with it and have it live on you for a long period of time. It's going to be bouncing off of everything, bouncing off your gear, bouncing off of doors, bouncing off of vehicles, muzzle thumping things, the grip hitting doorways. This is just the reality of firearms that are carried. And this is why I think that if you are carrying a gun, you should probably be carrying a gun that you aren't afraid to mess the finish up on, or it's a gun that already has an imperfect finish. And if you are carrying a gun whose finish that you are worried about messing up, then it might not be a gun that you should consider carrying. Case in point, that's why one of my most carried guns is going to be this Smith & Wesson Model 36. That is really not in great condition, and the nickel plating is chipped and flaking in some places. It's really not a beautiful gun, but that's why I carry it, and that's why I don't worry about it too much when I shove it in my holster. So the next scenario I'd like to talk about is when it comes to hunting or sport shooting. These guns are typically not as well used as guns that are carried every day, but they are going in and out of bags, cars, stands, holsters, over the shoulder, etc. And so protective finishes can get displaced, stuff like your oils and waxes and stuff like that, they can get rubbed off. Now, some hunting guns are really nice, and people like to keep them that way to an extent, and they're not taking them out every single day, so it shouldn't be too much of a problem to apply a protective layer of oil or wax just before you go out and when you get them back indoors. And the same thing with sports shooting. These guns are handled more often than hunting guns, or they should be, and usually putting a protective layer before and after you take them out shouldn't be a problem. You never know what kind of condition the match will be held in, right? Now, for long-term storage, your location and consequently temperature and humidity matter a lot, as we're talking about long-term exposure, sometimes with very infrequent checkups or reapplication of oils or protectants, if any. The positive here is that you aren't handling these guns very often, so there's very little reason an old protective film should be displaced other than it evaporating. Evaporating is largely something that applies to gun oils rather than something like grease or cosmoline or waxes. So if you want to avoid evaporation, stick with one of those for long-term storage. My recommendation would be just check up on them every couple months or so if you're not taking them out to shoot. And if you are taking them out to shoot semi-frequently, like every few months or so, then again, it wouldn't be too much of a problem to just oil them up before and after you get back from the range. If you are going to be storing them longer than a few months, you really should think about using something that won't dry out, like grease or even cosmoline. Or if you want something that's less visually ugly and easier to remove and keep dust or lint off of, you should use something like Renaissance wax, neutral shoe polish, or my favorite recent product for this purpose, Gold Guard. The recommendations for long-term storage also kind of applies when it comes to home defense guns. If it's just a gun you have propped up in a corner of the room or on your nightstand or something like that, just check them out every so often and act accordingly. Typically, my go-tos for long-term storage were Renaissance wax and automotive wheel bearing grease. Before that, I would just use CLP and reapply it every once in a while because it does dry out over time. So let's talk about Gold Guard. Gold Guard comes in a liquid form, but it's not like a regular 3-in-1 oil or CLP. It's a solvent-based product specifically designed for corrosion protection. Instructions for use are very simple. All you have to do is take a clean patch, put a few drops of Gold Guard on it, and then you apply it over your gun. Once you've applied it to your gun, just go ahead and leave the gun to dry for an hour or so. The solvent evaporates and leaves behind a soft, waxy film on the metal, which seems to be about as protective as Renaissance wax, if not more so. That is to say, very corrosion resistant. Also, when left to dry for a longer period of time, that soft, waxy finish will harden and will not evaporate the way that CLP does. I think the best way to compare it is this. Renaissance wax, even though it's sort of the gold standard for long-term storage in the gun community, it being a hard paste / wax from the get-go is kind of hard to get into the small corners of things. And it can also be kind of annoying to apply quickly and evenly since it doesn't spread very well. It also emits a very potent chemical smell that gives me a headache anyways, especially indoors. Gold Guard, on the other hand, goes on as a liquid, so it has all of the ease of application that CLP does. You can even apply it, by your finger to all metal parts like they teach you in the military, but it dries to that waxy film just like Renaissance wax does, and it's as good, if not better, than Renaissance wax. The other thing is that Gold Guard going on as a liquid means that you get a pretty even layer no matter what. It doesn't like to build up on like corners and serrations and stuff like that like Renaissance wax does. And the other thing is Gold Guard kind of does smell like crayons to me, which is always a plus. So I think all that combined is really the biggest benefit for me, because I can take 15 to 30 seconds to completely cover a gun in a nice even layer of Gold Guard with a single patch. Whereas with Renaissance Wax, that gun would probably take 2 to 3 minutes of having to repeatedly get some wax on a cloth, then rub it on, then remove the excess, as Renaissance Wax does like to build up. And with the Renaissance Wax, I would still miss spots as it's hard to get into the tight corners and stuff. Grease is a little bit better when it comes to application, but it's messy and it smells like death. It's probably not healthy for you, and it's annoying to remove, and it's always wet or greasy, which isn't ideal either. Now, some usage recommendations from the manufacturer of Gold Guard. They say that if you intend to carry the gun, after you apply it, you can just shove it straight into your holster rather than waiting for it to dry. Reapplication doesn't require you to remove your old Gold Guard either. You just put a new layer right over the top. The only time the manufacturer recommends removing the old layer of Gold Guard before reapplication would be if the current layer has been heavily contaminated, for example, with a lot of sweat, salts, etc. Now, Gold Guard does have a slight thickness to it, just like wax or cosmoline, and it's not as easily displaced or pushed out of the way like CLP or oils are. So the manufacturer does not recommend using Gold Guard in the bore of a gun that's going to be actively shot. Something like CLP is better for that application. Now, for hunting guns, range guns, rare use guns, or midterm storage, say 1 to 12 months, it's recommended to heavily saturate the patch and put a nice thick heavy film on the gun, then let it dry to that waxy finish for the next time you use it. And again, unlike something like grease or cosmoline, you shouldn't remove Gold Guard from the gun the next time you take the gun out. So just put it into storage with a thick layer of Gold Guard, and it's ready to go the next time you take it out. And once you bring it back indoors, just put a fresh layer of Gold Guard anywhere it might have rubbed off before you put it back in storage. Now, when it comes to your home defense gun, it's pretty much the same deal, but the only thing is a good internal lubricant is recommended, like a mil-spec CLP or this other product from Nano Arms Chemistry known as Nano Waffenöl Universal, which is, I think, Dutch or Deutsch for Nano Gun Oil Universal, although there is a segment of the internet out there who likes to refer to this stuff as Kum oil. You know who you are. Anyway, the reason why I like this is because it looks funny, but it also has a great German magic trick up its sleeve. When nano oil dries out after 6 months or so, which all oils of this weight typically will do, it leaves essentially a dry lubricant behind, kind of like that powdered graphite stuff, but much, much better. So even when nano oil dries out, it still has a lubricating property left over. This isn't really so much of an issue if you're using something like a good mil-spec CLP, but some products like WD-40, which some people still use on their guns, will dry out and will gum up in action. So the last thing you want to do is have to use your nightstand Smith & Wesson only to find out it has a 30-pound trigger pull because the WD-40 you sprayed under the side plate 2 years ago has turned into chewing gum. And that's why I only use the finest Kum oil. Back to Gold Guard. For guns that you want to display or hang up on the wall, so-called wall hangers, Gold Guard is well suited for that too, since it is a dry finish and it won't attract as much dust as like CLP will. Here the manufacturer says that it can also be used for internal protection, and to get into hard to reach places, they recommend you put a drop down into the mechanism and then spread them out with a brush. After you get into the hard to reach places, you can go ahead and cover all the smooth surfaces just like usual. Take a saturated patch and spread it all over. And they also recommend going over any of the areas you brushed with the saturated patch. After you apply the Gold Guard, you can just go ahead and put the gun on the wall and let it dry on the wall and stay there for a few years. But the manufacturer advises that you check once or twice a year just in case that you missed a spot. To remove any dust that builds up over the years, the manufacturer recommends using a clean, dry cloth or towel, and then a fresh layer of Gold Guard can be applied directly on it before putting the gun back on the wall. The final scenario is going to be long-term storage where reapplication is not possible. Essentially, this is you're taking a gun and you're going to store it for, years and years and years without touching it. In that instance, the manufacturer recommends that you put as thick a layer as possible over the entire gun, including the internals. It's also important to brush the Gold Guard into all the spots where a normal patch can't reach, stuff like the sights, serrations, stampings, etc. And again, just like before, when you pull the gun out of storage, you can completely ignore the Gold Guard on the outside of the finish. In fact, it's probably recommended to leave that on, but the manufacturer does recommend taking the gun apart, cleaning the internals that you coated with Gold Guard, and cleaning out the bore if you use Gold Guard on the bore for storage before you go ahead and start shooting the gun. Gold Guard can be very easily removed using any CLP or gun oil, which is a huge advantage over old school Cosmoline, which can be a real pain in the ass to remove sometimes. You gotta like bake the parts in the oven and then you can kind of scoop it off. Huge mess. Gold Guard, you can put as thick a layer as you want, and a few drops of CLP will start to dissolve it and you can wipe it off with a clean cloth. And remember, as thick a layer as possible is recommended for long-term storage. Now, just to reiterate, for long-term storage only, the manufacturer does say it's okay to use Gold Guard on the bore and put a big thick layer in there. But just like with Cosmoline, the next time you go and pull that gun out, you want to go ahead and remove that Gold Guard from the bore before shooting it. And again, you can do this just by running a CLP soaked patch through and then a dry patch and then a CLP patch, and then just look through and see that none of the Gold Guard's left. You'll be able to tell the Gold Guard will be kind of hazy and waxy, right? And the CLP will be nice and shiny. Now to wrap this up, I know this sounds like shilling, but I have been using the NanoArms chemistry products for like over 2 years now, and I'm very happy with them. They're kind of my go-to products now. My go-to lubricant is going to be the Coom oil, and then my go-to like long-term storage, like guns for the rack on the wall, because most of my guns I don't actually shoot very often. I use a lot of Gold Guard, right? And I even use Gold Guard on my lathe here. I was having problems with this lathe rusting in this shed, especially in the transitional like seasons. And ever since I put the Gold Guard on it, the only places that it's rusting are on the places where I missed a spot. So I usually go back in, remove whatever surface rust is on there, put a layer of Gold Guard on there. But yeah, this thing's staying incredibly rust-free on all the places where I applied Gold Guard. So I really do believe this stuff works. I've also gone and done a science experiment too, with like CLP on one side, Ezox on the other, and Gold Guard in the middle, and Gold Guard performed by far the best. I think CLP and Ezox failed several weeks, if not months, before the Gold Guard did. So yeah, this stuff really does work. And if you apply this in combination with making sure that your guns are stored in like a nice climate controlled building, then your guns will have no problems with rust. And in fact, the only problems they'll have, again, is if you miss a spot, right? And then you just go back in and put some more Gold Guard in there. Now the company is pretty small. It's mainly just one guy in Germany, and he wanted to thank me for kind of helping them out. I'm not really being super compensated for this stuff. Number one, I kind of wanted to just make like a general video talking about how to prevent your guns from rusting, because I want to make sure as many guns out there stay in good shape as possible, because why not, right? And the owner and main guy at the NanoArms chemistry company has pretty much the same idea about these things, so I'm happy to help them out. And the only way they really compensate me is like they give me bottles of Gold Guard and Coom oil, and they give me some info on like how these things are formulated. But he's a pretty cool dude. He's really passionate about it. He's super German. I really just want to help him out. Anyways, that's my story and I'm sticking to it. Last but not least, Marcus, the guy that runs the company from Germany, he wanted me to include a little thank you note that he wrote for me, specifically for this video that I've been putting off for several months at this point, and I'm finally getting around to, and he wanted me to read it one-to-one, so let me go ahead and do that for you. We can't thank Jared enough for helping us with an instructional video. This doesn't just enable our customers to use Gold Guard's full potential and avoid rust on their firearms, it also helps a young company from Germany immensely. Unified instructions for our customer base also gives us the opportunity to better handle customer feedback, improve the product in the lab, and release an upgraded version that performs even better while working with the initial set of instructions and customer habits. I know, it's terrible, but that's all I got. Thanks for watching. It's like 80% humidity in here and I need a beer.